Is the world facing a new major conflict? Will the United States make Iran its next military target? On March 20th, 2013, on his visit to Israel, President Obama crossed a line in his dealings with the Islamic Republic.
Consultation between our militaries, our intelligence. We agree that a nuclear-armed Iran would be a threat to the region, a threat to the world, and potentially an existential threat to Israel. And I will repeat, all options are on the table. We will do what is necessary to prevent Iran from getting the world's worst weapons.
For almost 10 years, the regime in Tehran has always claimed innocence. Iran is only developing its sole nuclear plant for civilian use.
I declare
that the Islamic Republic of Iran has never sought to own nuclear weapons and will never give up its right to the pacific use of nuclear energy.
Despite these denials, the West knows for sure that the land of the mullahs is seeking to obtain the bomb at all costs.
Yeah, no, the Iranians have lied over and over and over again. I mean, there's no doubt. You know, they try to act like they don't lie on this stuff, but they've lied over and over again, and it's gone on for decades.
The situation with Iran has now developed to the point where it's too late.
I can tell you, we're not talking about the long term. We are not talking about years.
They reach that capability, reasonable capability, sometime next summer 2013.
The bomb is within their reach, and the Iranians are growing more and more provocative.
You would never be able to prevent Iran from nuclear bomb if Iran decide to do so. You cannot prevent it.
Will the West be able to halt this particular arms race? For over 10 years, its satellites have been trained on hidden sites, its agents infiltrating networks. Recently, sabotage missions and assassinations have risen in number. This is the story of a shadow war, the outcome of which is terrifying the entire planet. Soon after 9/11 in 2001, before the U.S. Congress, President George W. Bush defined the new axis of evil: North Korea, Iraq, and Iran.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger.
800 kilometers above the Earth, satellites began spying on suspect activities, notably in Iran. In the summer of 2002, Western intelligence services received crucial information from the People's Mujahideen of Iran. This organization of exiled Iranian opponents seeking to overthrow the mullahs uncovered a nuclear site hidden by the regime. David Albright is a former inspector for the UN's International Atomic Energy Agency, which monitors nuclear development. He remembers the shock of the revelation made by infiltrated opponents in Iran.
In 2001, we tried to get information about secret Iranian sites from governments, and we failed. And suddenly in August of 2002, MEK emerges with information about 2 sites, one near Natanz, one in Iraq.
We asked the activists of the People's Mujahideen of Iran inside Iran to look into what's going on in Natanz and what they can find out in Natanz. After a while, they came back and said, there are some very, very strong electrical power lines brought into an area in suburbs of Natanz. The cover for that area was a project for eradication of deserts. But the fact that they were bringing very strong power lines and they were brought into underground facilities made us very, very suspicious that it has nothing to do with desert eradication. Then our sources in Natanz came back and said, look, there are very, very strong foundations are being made in this place, which again added to our suspicion that this might have something to do with the nuclear project.
To alert public opinion, the People's Mujahideen held a press conference at Washington's Hotel Intercontinental.
Atomic Energy Organization has set up many fronts for WMD.
At the same time, spy satellites zoomed in on Natanz, 300 kilometers south of Tehran. The images revealed a partially buried installation, pointing to a uranium enriching plant.
But then when this came to public, that it's in Natanz, we saw the satellite pictures and we found out that this is a very big place. So this doesn't come very quickly, you know, this is something which is a development which takes over several years. So for us it was obvious that there must be quite a lot of activities in Iran which we didn't know.
The
Iranians were caught red-handed. They were completely in the wrong. Considering their signing of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and their agreements with the International Atomic Energy Agency, they should have declared this small plant that already had centrifuges, etc. But they neglected to, or rather made sure they didn't, and therefore they were totally breaking the law.
So my first thing in August 2002 was to write a letter to Iran. I was a director, so I wrote a letter. After talking with Mr. El Baradei, I wrote a letter to Iran and asking them to explain. And the person to whom actually I addressed this letter was, at that time was Ambassador Ali Salehi, who is today the Foreign Minister of Iran.
And what was the answer?
The answer was, actually, it was not a very good answer. They were a little bit upset, frankly speaking, that we asked it that way.
Back then, diplomat Hossein Mousavian was about to become a negotiator at the United Nations. This Iranian's task was to hide the truth from the West. He went into exile in the US 5 years ago, but remains fervently patriotic about Iran.
We don't need to inform everybody. In France, on enrichment, on nuclear activities, 80% of your activities are hidden. You are not revealing to everybody, neither US nor France. No country is going to reveal all his technological secrets for everybody every day.
Hossein Mousavian and the Iranian authorities were nonetheless forced to open the Natanz plant's doors to Oli Heinonen and his team. The chief inspector of the IAEA discovered hundreds of centrifuges, state-of-the-art technology that produces fuel for nuclear power, but also raw material for the bomb.
I was actually surprised what I saw, you know. I have seen a lot, but you know, when we got there, it's a huge complex, tremendous underground halls, very well secured. But then the most striking thing for me, which I will never forget, was they had a small exhibition hall, maybe a size of tennis court, which was full of various components of centrifuges. There were a couple of centrifuges as a model. It was very well organized, and when I saw that, I knew that this is a serious business.
The Iranian regime could no longer deny the evidence. It had opened a nuclear complex unauthorized by the UN, but Iran continued to cover up the origin of its centrifuges.
Iranians said in the beginning that this is their own invention. For me, it was obvious from the very beginning, can't be the case, because it was so far advanced. I had seen something similar in Europe, so I knew that this is close to something which I have seen elsewhere, but at that point of time, I was not personally sure.
Who could have helped Iran equip itself with these secret centrifuges? The suspicions of Western intelligence services would soon focus on neighboring Pakistan, the only Muslim country to have tested its own bomb 4 years earlier. At the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, the chief of the fight against nuclear proliferation had been spying on Pakistan's activities for several years. Agent Richard Barlow soon drew a link between the centrifuges discovered in Iran and Pakistan.
We knew all about what the Pakistanis were doing. We had, I would say, the best intelligence in history on a nuclear weapons program. We knew what the Pakistani bomb ate for breakfast. My concern, my superiors' concern, and the concern of people, other people, counter-proliferation people in the State Department, the Department of Energy, and even in the White House, other places, was we knew from day one. I mean, Khan and the Prime Minister of Pakistan and others made very, very clear from day one that they were developing the Islamic bomb. It wasn't just the Pakistani bomb. And that, you know, they envisioned kind of a nuclear secured caliphate spreading, you know, all the way across, you know, from Asia all the way over to Turkey.
The former Pakistan Army Chief of Staff now confirms the existence of this secret alliance between his country and Iran.
This was 1988 when General Zia had died. After that, I was addressing my officers. And I said, look, this is a new dawn which is breaking in this region. Pakistan, 11 years of military rule has gone, and there is democracy in Pakistan. The Soviets have been defeated in Afghanistan and they have fallen back. The Iran-Iraq war has ended and the Iranians have emerged stronger. And they are free countries. I said, these three countries now, who have been the target of all aggression from outside, it is logical that they join together, like the European Union.
The man who supplied nuclear technology to these new Iranian allies was the so-called savior of Pakistan. Abdul Qadir Khan is a national hero who enabled his homeland to become a nuclear power.
A.Q. Khan's contribution was to bring uranium enrichment technology from Urenco. He had been working in Belgium and then in Holland, and when he was there, he had the chance to look at all the blueprints of the centrifuges. He photocopied them because he was tasked with translating them from Dutch into English. And so that's his contribution of bringing the information to Pakistan and then reverse engineering.
He simply stole the documents from this company and returned to Pakistan, where he built his centrifuges. Gradually, he was able to obtain enough enriched uranium to make the first Pakistani warheads.
The Prime Minister, he gave freedom to Dr. A.Q. Khan, gave him the money and gave him the freedom, go beg and borrow and steal from anywhere the technology that you could get.
It was at this lab complex in Islamabad that Dr. Khan quietly began making centrifuges destined for countries other than Pakistan.
Initially, the goal of the laboratory was to produce highly enriched uranium only for the Pakistani nuclear program. But after some time, A.Q. Khan and some of the top generals in the Pakistan army, they sensed that there was a market, something that could be used, well, for increasing the exports of the country.
We are a poor country and we have a huge debt burden on us. And we know that the Western countries have been writing off the debt of several nations in the past. In fact, it's a couple of dozen countries whose debts have been written off. Pakistan is in a similar situation, and the IMF and the World Bank, courtesy the Americans and the Western nations, have refused to reschedule our debt. In that case, what do? We let people of Pakistan die of hunger? If you do not give us relief on our debt servicing, then there is something that we can sell.
In the late 1990s, with the backing of corrupt military men, the savior of Pakistan's secret nuclear business would prosper thanks to a worldwide manufacturing and commercialization network.
There were probably about a dozen, people who actually, worked for Khan. But then they recruited people who worked for companies in 10 different countries, So it's really much larger than that. And then the Pakistani Atomic Energy Commission had their own network. And there were quite a few people involved in that as well. And they worked out of embassies, military officers were involved. I mean, it was a very complicated, large network, all told together on, 3 or 4 different continents,
His contribution was to bring people together and make them act effectively as one unit. I would say that in the same way, in contacting the rest of the world and setting up this export business, he could not do it by himself. So he got help from the army. And you could say that the army wanted him, or at least parts of the army wanted him, because there's a lot of personal profit also to be made in this.
Despite the evidence gathered on these illegal dealings, CIA agents were under orders not to intervene, so as not to upset Pakistan, an old ally of White House strategists.
I mean, it was very clear that, the predominating forces within our government did not want to go after Pakistan's nuclear program. They viewed Pakistan as our friends and our ally, which I have never thought they were. That's been the mistake. That's still the mistake as we sit here today.
Like Richard Barlow, the People's Mujahideen had uncovered the commercial relationship between Abdul Qadir Khan's network and the Iranian army in the mid-1980s, even before the manufacture of the first Pakistani bomb.
In the middle of the Iran-Iraq war, you have a meeting of 3 lieutenants and key players of A.Q. Khan with the Iranian interlocutors. One of them is the top commanders of Revolutionary Guards. We established the identity of that man, Mohammad Salami, who is now a brigadier general, a key player in the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. A very reasonable question. What a Revolutionary Guards commander needs to meet A.Q. Khan people if it's only for civilian purposes? Secretly in United Arab Emirates.
So Richard Barlow's sources were reliable, but the CIA agents' repeated warnings ended up annoying the partisans of Pakistan in the White House.
They tried to get me fired, they tried to get me removed from working on the target, on the Pakistan target. I ended up in a huge, battle between the Directorate of Operations and the Directorate of Intelligence within the Central Intelligence Agency. And, my life became very, very, very stressful. My chain of command did not want me to leave. They wanted me to stay. But, it was affecting my career prospects, this situation. I stuck it out for a while. And then, against their wishes, I could have stayed at the agency forever if I'd wanted to. I left. If we continued to target the Khan network, we would have known when they started selling. Whether they were buying or selling, we would have known, But that's really the secondary point. The primary point is, if we'd put the network out of business in the late 1980s, like I and others were attempting to, there would have been no selling, period.
For 15 years, the U.S. closed its eyes. But in 2003, after the discovery of Pakistani centrifuges at the Natanz plant in Iran, its intelligence service finally got the nod to act. Western agents at last had the task of dismantling the global trafficking of nuclear material by Abdul Qadir Khan.
Really wasn't that interested in the end point. They just wanted to make the sale. And they would make the sale by commissions, by consulting, and so I don't think these were highly motivated people to help any country get nuclear weapons. I think they were highly motivated businessmen who saw a niche market and walked into it.
Among the network's businessmen, the CIA would identify a family of traffickers from the small town of Sangal in Switzerland. With their father Friedrich, Urs and Marco Tiener were the cornerstones of Abdul Qadir Khan's traffic. From the late 1980s, this engineering family had been making and exporting nuclear material with complete impunity.
Who are they? They are Swiss engineers, you know, very talented engineers for producing high-precision equipment. Father Fred Tiener has several technical patents, you know, and they had a very flourishing companies, you know, in 1980s and 1990s. And
their father was an early recruit of A.Q. Khan, so his involvement with A.Q. Khan goes back into the 70s, and he appears to have been a very dedicated seller to Pakistan.
Later on, I mean, his sons played a crucial role when the network started selling. I mean, it went way beyond the initial activities. They started actually having offshore manufacturing facilities in Malaysia and other places where they were making parts and, you know, that were then later sold to Libya, Iran, etc. And his sons played a very, very crucial role.
The Tiener family business saga came to an end. The CIA forced them to collaborate. They would become vital informers.
I think what I hear in Washington is more, they were approached. It wasn't suddenly Friedrich out of nowhere coming to the CIA and saying, "Oh, I've had a moment of clarity and I want to do good." They were approached and confronted that they had a choice, because what the CIA would have had collected a lot, and MI6. I mean, they would have collected a lot of information about the Tieners' activities, which they could turn over to a prosecutor in Switzerland.
The Tieners therefore became double agents, unbeknownst to their Iranian and Libyan clients. The Swiss traffickers gave Western intelligence services bills, centrifuge designs for Iran, and even blueprints for making the bomb. In the fall of 2003, they gave up the most important piece of information. A freighter, loaded with material from a Khan plant in Malaysia, was in the Mediterranean bound for Libya.
The destination was clearly Libya. It was centrifuge components and going to a country that swore it had no secret centrifuge program. And here was 100% concrete evidence of a centrifuge program existing in Libya. The Tieners also turned over documentation so that you could see that they were making centrifuge components themselves in Switzerland.
The BBC China was seized in Tarente on the Italian coast. CIA agents found 2,000 centrifuges hidden in containers. UN inspectors hurried to Libya. There they were met with a disturbing discovery. In a hangar in Tripoli, they found other centrifuges, the same as those identified 8 months earlier in Iran at the Natanz plant.
Yeah, it was just the same, packed same way, same pieces. So you immediately knew that, you know, you are talking about the same equipment and same source. And at the same time, you know, the Libyans were perhaps a little bit more forthcoming about their relation with Pakistan than the Iranians were. So it gave us additional leverage when we went for our investigations in Iran.
To Western investigators, there was no longer any doubt regarding the guilt of Abdul Qadir Khan, father of the Pakistani bomb, in this global nuclear trafficking.
Then we knew that we have a big problem. On one hand, I was happy because I saw what I had seen in Iran. Then I knew that what is the problem here, and it made our life easier in terms of the investigation. But at the same time, we got worried because when you saw the technology which was there, and you start to think that who else got it? And it turned out that then, for example, certain things went to Iran. They were offering also things to Iraq, and then also to North Korea.
From then on, Pakistan, the new hub of nuclear proliferation, would become the target of the United States. On September 24, 2003, in New York, in the wings of the United Nations General Assembly, Pakistan's President Pervez Musharraf was cornered by the head of the CIA. George Tenet gave him an ultimatum.
There was smoking gun proof that the Americans had, which they showed to him, showed to the world, that Pakistan was indeed supplying materials, nuclear materials. America is not in the bad shape that it is in now. At that time, it was a very threatening entity. And Musharraf was quite firmly in the American camp, well, plus or minus a little bit. And he therefore had to do something.
UN inspectors were also allowed to play a part. They left for Pakistan to demand the halt of the traffic towards countries hostile to the West.
So I think it was the 22nd or 21st of December 2003 when we had the first meetings with the Pakistanis. And well, they were not overly helpful in the beginning because, it was a big problem for them. Pakistani government has all along denied that this was a government-level decision. They say that there were these rogue scientists like Mr. A.Q. Khan, who was, unauthorized and dealing with this, and then some other people. And also in other countries, it was the same story. It was always, government was not involved, but there were some individual people who wanted to make money out of this.
If he had not taken action against A.Q. Khan, I think there would have been a serious effect upon Pakistan.
President Pervez Musharraf had no choice. He had to sacrifice the savior of Pakistan, father of the country's bomb, to avoid an American offensive.
That Musharraf had to defame, disgrace Dr. A.Q. Khan, which he did. There was no reason for it. He was mandated to do it.
Do you think it's a pressure of the Americans?
Of course, yes.
But
of course,
why?
yes. I mean, they didn't want that he should emerge as a hero, example for others. They wanted to demolish him, to destroy his image. But we know that Pakistani nation respects him as much as they respected him before. But the fact is that Musharraf has not been nice with him. He has done a lot of harm to Dr. A.Q. Khan, to Pakistan itself.
On February 4, 2004, Abdul Qadir Khan was forced to confess to his sins on Pakistani TV and put on the official costume of traitor to the nation.
In my interviews with the concerned government officials, I was confronted with the evidence and the findings, and I have voluntarily admitted that much of it is true and accurate.
The condemnation of the savior of Pakistan would give rise to support from the general public. Abdul Qadir Khan was placed under house arrest until 2008, but was never handed over to American justice. Pakistan, under pressure from the US, ceased exporting nuclear materials. But Iran continued its secret program, and the international community continued seeking to uncover it. In early 2004, Tehran refused to admit that Khan had supplied it with materials to manufacture the bomb.
Pakistan helped Iran to create his own technology.
Why not? You helped.
Is it true?
It is the IAEA report. But let's say it is true.
You were in charge, so you know what...
I was not in charge in that time, but whoever they did right thing. Why not? You, French supported Israelis to make nuclear bomb. You are not blaming yourself?
It is said that Pakistan helped Iran. Do you agree with that?
I was not in charge, and I really don't know. I say, let's assume this is a correct assessment. There is nothing wrong.
To the United Nations, Iran's secret nuclear program was worse than illegal. It was unacceptable, and the regime of the mullahs knew it.
Iran stopped its efforts to make an atomic bomb for 2.5 years because they were scared that, after Iraq, America would attack them next.
The Iranians made a number of gestures, like stopping their nuclear program, because they thought they could reach an agreement with the West. But they were to be disappointed. It didn't work out because Europe, under American influence, wanted more. Europe wanted a complete halt to the program. Then, as Iran gradually realized it would get absolutely nothing from negotiation stagnated, then died. And Iran announced the continuation of its enriching activity, which they had ceased for about 2 years.
The UN had won some time, but the international community was convinced that Iran would continue its secret manufacturing. In the mid-2000s, Western spy networks stepped up their surveillance. A new game of hide-and-seek began.
In the last, basically, especially in the last 10 years, this has been the situation. We have made the revelations. We have urged the international community and IAEA to go and check. And the Iranian regime has tried to prevent access, trying to hide things, have lied to the international community, and trying to say, oh, there's nothing wrong going on here.
In late 2004, after intelligence provided by the People's Mujahideen, UN inspectors demanded to visit a suspect site.
The Iranian resistance made a revelation about a place called Lavizan in Tehran. This was basically the brain center of the research for making nuclear bomb. Given the experience of Natanz and Iraq, Iranian regime became very, very panicky. They said, IAEA might come and wants to check this place. So it's better to close it down and move to a different place. By the time they went to Lavizan, they saw a place which was completely wiped out. Everything taken out. Even the dirt was taken out from 4 meters down deep. A lot of trees were cut down, so they wanted to make sure there's no trace.
They've just lied too many times, and I've been dealing with this issue since at least the early 90s pretty intensely. I've been in a room with Salehi, where he's almost yelling at me, swearing in the late 90s, we have no centrifuge program. And I'm arguing with him, well, we see this procurement, we see that procurement, you have a centrifuge program. And so he's now the foreign minister. And I look back, and with evidence we have now, documents, he was involved, appears to have been involved deeply in the illicit procurement for parts of the military dimensions of the program on centrifuges. So, you know, they lie from the top to the bottom.
For the West, this bluffing game had gone on long enough. In January 2007, tension mounted. A mysterious series of murders of Iranian scientists created a climate of fear in Tehran.
One part the people perceived to be part of the nuclear weaponization program. Shah Harari was killed. The same day, Abbasi Divani was almost killed. They're linked in documents to past efforts to make nuclear weapons, to do certain types of work. There was another person killed who was involved in procurement. And the implication is that he was involved in secret procurement for the centrifuge program. So he's out breaking the laws. So it appears to have been an effort to kill key people in what is really a small program.
Between 2007 and 2012, 5 Iranian scientists and 2 army leaders were killed by poison, gunshots, or explosions.
I don't think the U.S. is doing it. I mean, I think here really don't look upon that in a favorable light. It's just not a good tactic.
Les Américains ont dit c'est pas nous.
The Americans vigorously claimed it wasn't them. We may or may not believe them. But they said, we don't do that kind of thing and we don't approve of it. It wasn't the European secret services. So there's only one suspect, even if I'm for innocent until proven guilty, and that's Israel, which, according to its usual methods, neither denied nor claimed responsibility.
Former politician Michael Bar-Zohar, close to the incumbent president during this string of assassinations, does not deny it. On the contrary.
There are several versions, but I can't give you an official version, as there isn't one. But there are definitely Israeli agents operative in Iran, but under a different cover, of course. There are also Mujahideen agents, trained by the Israelis, who run bases close to the borders with Iran. Plus, there are agents from Kurdistan. These are Kurds who can speak Persian and are therefore able to infiltrate the population. So there are people of all origins, Israeli, Iranian, Kurd, operating in different fields and categories.
One part of the secret war between Western countries and Iran was the killing of physicists. What is your involvement in that?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Actually, the Iranian regime makes all sorts of claims, but that's the Iranian regime, and they're known to be liars all the time. You know, if one would have trusted them, by now one would have believed that they have no secret nuclear program to begin with.
For Mujahideen members, the assassination of Iranian scientists would undermine their undercover intelligence work.
And obviously the Iranian regime every day, every minute tries to find out who gives information to the resistance. But they do take big risks. But they do it because they realize that if the mullahs get the bomb, that will be devastating for the Iranian people.
And the operatives that have been cut by the regime?
There have been some who have paid, very, very heavy prices. Yes, there have been some.
In those revelations?
In some revelations.
Like?
I cannot go into details. But there have been some.
And what happened to them?
They spend a lot of time in jail and they have been through a lot of hardship.
They have been killed?
Not that I know of, but they have gone through a lot of torture, hardship, and long prisons.
Israel is the country that feels most endangered by the Iranian nuclear threat. All those involved in this shadow war agree, and the Israeli secret services don't balk at taking action inside the Islamic Republic.
A year ago, there was an attack on an Iranian missile base, and the whole thing blew up, killing the general in charge of the missile unit.
de section missile qui a été tué. Et tout le monde a écrit sur le fait qu'il a
All
été
newspaper articles focused on his death, but everyone neglected the true aim of the operation, which was to halt or postpone the tests with the rocket that could carry a warhead 10,000 kilometers or 6,000 miles away.
6,000 miles.
So that was a Mossad operation.
It wasn't a CIA op or a British Secret Service op, although they do provide very good, precise information. But they didn't send their agents in there. The ones that went in, leading the front line, were the Israelis.
In the past 6 years, attacks and assassinations on Iranian soil have increased. They have encouraged extremism and strengthened the mullah's rule.
If someone comes to Paris and assassinate your scientists, what would be your feelings? First of all, the West and the Israelis, they created hateness. Second, more support domestically for the nuclear technology and for the people in charge.
Assassination's a bad tactic. And what happens now? Abbasi Divani survived, and he's now head of the Atomic Energy Organization, and he appears to be one of the worst hardliners. And he's now has a lot more influence than he did before.
In the mid-2000s, the regime in Tehran sped up its race for the bomb. To avoid the destruction of its sites, it employed even more trickery. In 2009, French agents announced they had located a new site, hidden away in the village of Fordo, 200 kilometers from Tehran.
I often went back and forth between Tehran and Qom. And halfway between, there was a mountain with so many tunnels it was like a Swiss cheese. I kept saying to my colleagues that we should find out what was going on. Did I urge them into action? Who knows? It's possible. Maybe others got onto the scent. Whatever, the French played an important part in discovering this site, which was until then totally secret.
Actually, our sources told us that there's some very, very strange activities going on in north of Qom. And the regime is digging up a lot of tunnels in that area, underground. And that's when we started looking to why the regime is working in Qom and why do they need to go underground? What is there to be hidden? And that's how we found out that they're working on a new site in Qom, in a place called Fordo.
Why? What is the purpose, so, to build those secret plants? What's the purpose? It's for the bomb?
The second one,
yeah.
Under the mountain.
Yeah.
Because Israelis, they started to threaten Iran with military strike. And the US, even President Obama, Bush and Obama both, always reiterated military attack is an option.
By the late 2000s, relations with Iran had almost broken off. Iran stepped up its nuclear bomb program, while America looked for a way to thwart it. In the heart of the Rocky Mountains, in the isolated town of Idaho Falls, the Secret Services would test their new weapon, codenamed Olympic Games.
Here in the United States, they built what essentially was a virtual model of the Natanz nuclear enrichment site. They built a model of the plant, not the full size, and they spread it out over many of the U.S. national laboratories so that even people working in the laboratories weren't clear what they were trying to do. But the idea was to replicate the operation of the plant and see whether they could make the centrifuges explode.
Using the centrifuges seized on the BBC China in 2003, American researchers would try out a new weapon, a computer worm known as Stuxnet. This IT engineer was the first to analyze the devastating effects of this virus.
Well, what's really interesting about Stuxnet is it was very, very targeted in its purpose. It was looking specifically for computers that were running the hardware used to spin uranium cylinders. Once it was infecting those machines, what it did was spin those machines at such a high rate that those cylinders would, in essence, be destroyed.
They finally did, and one day, they took the rubble from one of these centrifuges, flew it to Washington.
The CIA hackers required the president's authorization to launch their new Millennium War. They went head-to-head with George W. Bush in the White House crisis room.
Brought it to the White House and dumped it out on the conference room table inside the Situation Room. It was then that President Bush said, okay, go ahead and try.
In June 2010, Operation Olympic Games was deployed. On the other side of the planet, in Natanz, Iran's biggest nuclear enriching plant suffered a cyber attack worthy of a spy novel.
The malware was brought in by somebody who did business with this place, probably on a USB drive. That USB drive came out of their pocket and went into one of the computers there, and now a computer inside that plant is infected.
Different versions of the worm had different impact. In the case of the Stuxnet variety, there was an effort to go after a particular group of a little less than 1,000 of the 5,000 centrifuges that were operating at that time. And that's what was ultimately destroyed.
Of course, for temporary period, it had effect to slow down the Iranian nuclear program. But immediately, just for some months, Iran could recover and could resist the attacks, to prevent the attacks, and to recover all damages.
The Iranians created a cyber corps of their own as part of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And it is supposed to both do cyber defense, which is also part of something called the Passive Defense Organization in Iran, and cyber offense. In recent months, Iran has been blamed, rightly or wrongly, for a computer attack on Saudi Aramco, which is one of the major Saudi oil producers. Also been blamed for some attacks on American banks.
As I said, here again, the Western countries helped Iran to know how to resist cyber attacks, to get know-how technology, to mobilize its forces, to establish one of the most powerful cyber army in the world.
Far from dissuading Iran, the American attacks made Tehran even more determined. And at Natanz, the damaged centrifuges were repaired. A few months ago, the UN inspectors even discovered they had increased in number, from 5,000 to 12,000.
Iran is progressing. It's progressing slowly due to various hitches, but it's nonetheless progressing. And the fact that the West has been unable to find solutions to this crisis, that there has been no negotiated solution, has worsened the crisis. And it's getting worse and worse day by day. Because Iran is gradually getting closer to the point where it will finally have the capacity to make the bomb. So we must consider that everything we've done so far, due to the inability to reach some kind of agreement, has failed.
Now the cost is going to be extremely high. This is what's happened. You know, when you let this go on and on and on, then the cost becomes higher and higher and higher. And in my opinion, the Iranians have absolutely no incentive to give up their nuclear weapons program. Sanctions are not going to work. The only way to bring an end to the Iranian nuclear weapons program is to bomb it.
If he wants to keep his promise, President Obama has only a few months left in which to prevent Iran from developing its own atomic bomb. But the idea of a military attack on the Islamic Republic divides the international community, because world peace can do without a new conflict between the West and radical Muslims.